Welcome everyone. This is Jim Bergman with Commercial Officers Group. I want to welcome you to today's session on preparing your supply chain for the next COVID wave. Today's speaker is Mike Kienitz. I've known Mike for a number of years. He has always had some great insights. Every time I have a chat with him, he's always bringing in some really interesting perspective. His background is quite diverse, as you can see from the screen. Mike, I'm going to let you do a self-introduction, and then we'll get into the content. So over to you, sir.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And as Jim said, I've known Jim, for a number of years, worked together for a bit as well. But from a background standpoint, if you look at my background, first 20 years of experience have been in large companies focused on strategic sourcing, supplier management, other operations functions. And then the last 8 to 10 years, I've transitioned into more of your mid-sized companies, working at SunPower, a leading solar power company, and then Yeti, a leading consumer product company. Jim, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, very good. So as many of you know, things have happened over the past few months. Mike, I'll let you address this, and we will then get into a little bit more detail.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll just briefly touch on what happened this spring, and I think most of the people in the audience and listening have experienced it in one form or another. And I think that the key takeaway as we'll go through this is, what are we going to do about it going forward? So if you look at this spring, we had supply that wasn't available, whether that was coming out of Asia, coming in, into the US, vice versa. Manufacturing locations had shut down and stopped all across the world. And a lot of companies were single sourced and reliant on a specific supplier out there that they had to adjust. Logistics got disrupted, both international shipments and localized shipments. And then ports were shut down and demand shifted significant. We all saw shifts in demand from, the US, or from retail into online, et cetera. And, I think that the key takeaway on that portion to think about is it got a lot of attention. Supply chain got a lot of focus, which is a good thing. As supply chain organizations, we've always known the importance of supply chain. But what do we need to do going forward so that, when this happens again, as things continue to worsen with COVID, as we enter the winter, how do we need to prepare? Because we can't, we may have gotten a pass on the first round as employees, as supply chain executives. How do we not get caught the second time around, not being prepared? And overall, we have to look at this holistically. We can't look at our supply chain and say, well, I had, for example, a tier 2 issue, and so I'm going to go address my tier 2 suppliers, or I had a shipping issue, so I'm going to go address shipping. It has to be holistic, because it does become the proverbial, put your finger in the dike and plug one hole and a new hole will pop up. So if I look at it, first we need to look at our suppliers, both tier 1 and tier 2, and we'll examine that in more detail. Second, we need to understand our logistics and distribution networks, and how do we prepare for those, and what are we doing to mitigate any risk there. Third, we need to look at our SIOP process, and is it keeping up with the times and the dynamics that are facing the industry and market today. And then finally,
Mike, I know that you're going to get in SIOP, but for those in the audience who are not yet familiar with SIOP, it's an acronym for
Sales, Inventory, Operations Planning.
Great.
And then finally, talent, tools, and skills. Do we need different talent? Are the tools that we use, are they keeping up? And are the skills that we have what we're going to need in the future as well? So if you go to the next slide, we'll go into some detail on supplier management. So if you look at it, the first part, as I've reached across the industry, different industries on what's happening, what's worked well during these COVID times, what hasn't. One of the biggest and most common themes is those companies who invested in relationships with their suppliers have seen a significant, minimization of any impact from COVID risk versus those who were much more transactional in their suppliers. So it's always been true, but it becomes more so in high risk, high variability times that relationship investments is a huge requirement for everyone, both at the supplier management level, but also at the supply chain executive level. And we need to get creative, right? We have moved away from, we don't have the opportunity to, fly to meet a supplier, have dinner, understand their manufacturing process, walk the floors conveniently. So we need to be creative, both, similar to what you're doing with your employees inside of the company today, whether that's having somebody who lives in the region, visits a supplier, or if it's something as simple as, buying dinner, snacks, and et cetera for your employees. Alternate sourcing, excuse me. We've traditionally looked at alternate sourcing as a way to drive additional suppliers, reduce cost, et cetera. Inside of that, we need to really look at how do we diversify our risk.
And Michael, let me interrupt you and get a sip of water for a sec too. In terms of creating alternate sources and diversifying the risk, do you see there being a need to always have sort of that second shadow supply chain, if you will, and they understand, or is it best to have them active and engaged, and so you're sort of having active redundancy, or is it more of a alternate source that they are told, we're not using you yet, but if we need to, we will? Which of those two approaches are you suggesting here as alternate source? Mike?
To answer your question, good question, Jim. We have to have another active supplier. And the other takeaway on this is we need to understand where the suppliers are located, what their tier 1 and tier 2 supply chain looks like, so that when we're adding them, we're not adding somebody who's next door, they're a convenient supplier, they'd be easy to move to, but we're actually adding somebody who diversifies the risk and gives us flexibility. So if you take, for example, you're a US-based customer, you have a supplier in Asia, perhaps you should be looking at a supplier in Mexico who can give you a shorter lead time, different reduced risk out there for overall as well. If we go to the next slide, or next bullet. So as part of that, we should be looking at supplier selection beyond cost. So traditionally, supplier selection has been, hey, we have supplier A, let's bring in supplier B. Can they do it at a lower cost? Are they a better performer? We need to understand holistically how that affects risk to the business. And I think a key part as supply chain executives we need to be thinking about is what's the risk to the business? Think like, the CEO, the CFO of the company. That's what they need to be thinking about. That's part of their questions. Obviously, cost is important, delivery is important, but the overall package is a critical element in our supplier management and in our supplier selection. For our tier 2 suppliers, a key element is to really understand the risk profile of that supplier and those suppliers. And what I mean by that is, is it a common commoditized part that we're purchasing, or is it something complex that we can't get elsewhere? And if it's complex, we need, as supplier managers, to invest into that tier 2 supplier and understand and manage them and understand them. Because if there's an impact to that supply chain, and we saw that in the initial COVID, the initial spring COVID impact, many of the suppliers and delivery issues we had came from our tier 2 suppliers, not really from the tier 1 suppliers. A great example of that was in the tech industry, where suppliers had just simple capacitor type items coming out of Wuhan, China province, where things were delayed, things were constrained, and it'd be a simple item on a large PC board, and you couldn't get availability for it. So understand what that risk profile is and where those suppliers are located. And then from a tier 1 perspective, we need to be meeting with our suppliers right now and setting clear expectations that both they're managing the business, but also they're managing the risk. Some of the expectation of, continue to manage the risk for us as a customer, we need to have those suppliers doing the same thing. So meet with them in your quarterly business reviews, in your scorecards, set the expectations of understanding their tier 2, giving you visibility to their tier 2, and giving you visibility to what are they going to do about managing their risk as well.
Say, hey, Mike, before we go on, a question came in from audience, and it says follows: should companies be increasing our inventory to compensate for the additional risk and demand variability? Did you want to take that now or move on?
Sure, I can take that now. I think that we need to do, you need to look at it. There's definitely significant demand shifts that will happen, and we need to be ready for that. The second piece to that is, instead of we have to be careful though not to make a knee-jerk reaction to that adjustment and say, hey, let's just increase inventory. But we need to, again, do a full value stream map of the entire supply chain, how you can create flexibility, and how you can lean the supply chain out. Good question, Jim.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that response. On to logistics.
Sure, moving on to the logistics side. From a port, things to look at, first of all, is port management. So what is the status of your port? Even if a lot of us as supply chain leaders may not be managing the shipping, may not take ownership of the product until it arrives at our warehouse, etc. But we still need to understand the ports that they're shipping out of. Is there congestion? Are there issues, COVID-related issues? Are there alternate ports that are available for the supplier to ship from? So we need to work through that and understand it as well. In terms of international shipping, we need to be looking at what are the alternatives, right? So there are direct shipments that can come from internationally from port to port. There are traditional shipments that kind of make stops along the way. Obviously, there's air freight, but how do you plan and balance? Because as supply becomes constrained and then it opens up again, companies are competing for the limited availability of port space and shipping space. And how do you make sure that you're, as a customer, getting your unfair share of that space as well? And then finally, also constrained lanes. So if you look at the shipping today, as new businesses COVID impacts different regions differently, what we're seeing is it constrains both the regions that are not impacted at the time of one being impacted. So so we have to manage through that and be ready for it and be working with our supply chain or with our shipping partners. And then secondly, it impacts the lanes. Once the constraint is lifted, then you have people coming in and wanting to ship significantly out of that specific port or those specific lanes. So being aware of what's shifting and being aware of how to take advantage of that and make sure that you're getting shipments as fast as possible. And then finally, locking in availability. So as logistics have shifted, demand has shifted, we are needing to, as customers, identify how much capacity we're going to need and work with those customers, work with those suppliers and shipping partners to lock in whatever your specific availability is. So my coaching to people, as you look at the risk, is, understand the ports, understand where you can ship out of and what the status is in those ports, but at the same time, start looking at your needs and locking those in with your logistics partners now, so that you're not, in a competition for the few scraps that are out there. We touched earlier on SIOP, or sales, inventory, and operations planning. And this, I think, is one of the biggest areas that is changing in today's environment. The cycles, traditionally, a SIOP process has been a 4-week cycle, and it was demand submission, supply response, and then it would be a gap analysis, and then the executive SIOP. 4 weeks, the world changes really fast in today's environment. If you think back from a US perspective, and you can kind of work through Europe, Asia, backwards from there. But the month of March, the entire demand cycle completely changed. So we have to have the tools implemented to understand how that shifts faster. And then we have to work with our logistics carriers and work with our suppliers to adjust much more quickly. One of the key elements in enabling that is data analytics. So if you think about data today, we've traditionally kind of done an Excel spreadsheet, modify it, put it into a database, or pull it out of the database, look at it. The opportunity with AI, with quantum dynamics is high, and we should be able to use those data to really drive much faster cycles of, hey, the demand has shifted. How do we give that signal to our supplier, and how do we make adjustments to our purchase orders out there as well? And a key element included in that is really what happens inside the channels. So if you think about, as COVID has hit, retail shopping has significantly been decreased. Online has significantly increased. That hasn't necessarily shifted. If you said my overall demand, I'm running a company, my overall demand has stayed the same. What's happened in the channels has become very different, and that changes both what the needs are, but it also, you need to understand how much is in inventory in each of the locations. So if the channel is full sitting in the retail business, but it's not full supporting the direct-to-consumer business, how are you getting false signs and signals out there for the business as well? Then looking at really, what's the supplier response? How do you work, going back to the original supplier management, supplier relationship piece, having a different expectation with our supplier to respond to changes. So if I'm a supplier, previously I would get a demand signal, it'd be for 6 months, 1 year, what have you. and I have a large forward-looking forecast. Today, what I need to do is take an immediate change. If it's a new color, a new, a different a different SKU that's coming in with higher demand to versus something else, the suppliers need to be able to change to that. And we'll talk a little bit to that at the very end in terms of skills around lean and configure to order, etc. And then finally, logistics response. So again, we spoke earlier on the carriers and the carriers being ready and capable of having lanes available, communicating what what the availability port status is, what the shipping status is, if they're having any issues. And as supply chain leaders, we need to have tight interactions with our logistics carriers to understand how fast they can respond and what their capacity is. If they're, overbooked already, we have to realize that we can't expect that they're going to jump on whatever our requirements and needs are. Shifting into distribution and fulfillment, one of the first, and COVID's brought this to light a lot of what does our distribution network look like? And traditionally, a lot of companies have either just have one distribution center. They may have been vertically integrated. They may have owned it. They may have had a third party, but it's much easier to have one distribution center. An investment in multiple fulfillment centers, I think, is critical because it minimizes the risk. If you take the example of, hey, we're going to have another wave of COVID, it may hit a specific facility. If it hits a facility, that facility is down. You as a company are not able to ship a product to customers. The company's going to be, that's highly impactful for the business and the company. That brings it to its knees versus, hey, I can't ship out of Memphis, but I can ship out of Salt Lake City for the rest of the U.S. So maybe there's two locations. The main location's gone down. You have to rely on the West Coast location. That's okay. You can still maintain your business. It may have impacted your cost, but you can work through it. Fulfillment and demand management is really, we need to understand what does change and how do we, as you see the impact of e-commerce come together, we need to be able to adjust to these new demand scenarios out there as well. And then finally is re-looking at our metrics, understanding what are some leading indicators and deploying leading metrics and indicators versus the traditional, fill rate, on time and full, cycle count type metrics, but what's telling us that we have flexibility in the system, what metrics are giving us good visibility to, are we ready for a new spike? Are we ready for a change in demand?
Mike, could you elaborate a little further on the difference between leading versus lagging? Many in the audience do know, but some might not understand the nuance between those two.
Sure. And I think if I look in terms of, using the examples on distribution and fulfillment, we traditionally, companies have looked at on time and full or on time delivery of shipments. That would be a lagging metric that kind of says, hey, if our on time and full dropped from 98% to 70% in the month of November, if today we look back and said, hey, November dropped to 70%, it's almost too late for us to understand versus what's the employee capacity, how much should we be able to ship, what's our fill rate today as far as what is available to support customer demand, those type of things that are forward looking, saying, are we ready and capable Do we have resources? Do we have resources, and do we have material in place to support the forecasted demand that's out there?
Yeah, an example I've used many times is in terms of weather. Leading indicator is, what percentage of the sky is filled with storm clouds, and is the west looking darker in the sky than the east? And a lagging indicator is how many inches of rain or snow did we actually receive? And so it's somewhat more of a predictive rather than reactive. Leading is, but when it gets into distribution and fulfillment, Mike, I sense that you probably have some additional insights, and we're going to get into, if anyone has questions, to get hold of Mike after this session. We'll provide his email address. So this is an area that, at least if I can throw in my own personal comments, this is an area that I think many in the audience would have great benefit from if they were able to engage you in some further conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of it will go around tying the SIOP slide earlier, what's the demand forecast look like, to what's the available capacity from a shipping standpoint, both, available product, people availability, space availability, et cetera. And then tacking it down into, okay, are we picking and filling at the rates we need versus, our traditional on time and full, but doing that after the fact, doing that 2 weeks late, looking back at the beginning of November when we're 2 weeks into December type of scenario. So definitely have some ideas and some inputs I can provide. Happy to provide for people. And great insight there, Jim.
And Mike, one other thing, a question has come up, and that is, what should we be asking from our suppliers right now?
Again, I would go into that from a supplier, having the suppliers be proactive as well. So they should be providing leading indicators and metrics. So what is their existing manufacturing capacity? What's the demand versus that capacity? That capacity should include both, obviously, physical equipment and space, but also the people, understanding that the people can become a big variable as things change. Second, from a forward looking, is going to be their tier two or their supplier management, and where do they, of the BOM that they're providing, where do they have risk associated, and what's the location and of their tier two suppliers as well, so that you're not walking into a scenario where you say, hey, this supplier has plenty of capacity, lots of equipment, lots of people, but they have a tier two supplier who can't provide something, and both teams are jumping on trying to fix a small supplier in a remote location who's unable to support you today.
Okay, great. Better move us on here. Talent, tools, and skills.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. I'll touch on talent, and the first part on the talent, and one of the things both internally, for the people here, and then for hiring, the skills have shifted, right? We have been traditionally focused on negotiations, cost reduction, understanding product cost in detail, cost management. A lot of what is going to be required, at least through the times we're facing today, are more on supplier development, lean, building in lean tools, lean understanding how to do all of your lean metrics, and supplier relationship management. So being able to manage your suppliers and the co-prosperity elements associated with supplier management. So those skills, supplier development, supplier relationship management, lean management are going to be key skills, having shifted from some of our more traditional cost and negotiation focused skill sets.
Hey, Mike, if I could interrupt,
Mhm.
questions come in. I think but maybe they typed while you were talking because it does coincide very much with the talent, tools, and skills. Question is, in terms of talent, what should supply chain managers be looking at right now? What training should employees be focused on at this time to be the most valuable?
Okay. Yeah. And I think to the first part, I touched on it of, you know, understanding as you're interviewing candidates, as you're looking for new category managers, new buyers, is what have they done in terms of supplier development? What have they done in, you know, creating and building a new supplier? What have they done in terms of lean, understanding the entire value stream map and understanding how they can reduce waste and increase flexibility? If I was someone who was relatively new in the supply chain field and saying, what do I need to have training on? What's going to make me more valuable going forward? I would be investing my time in those categories in better understanding of supplier management and the tools associated. So expectation setting, um, more of a co-prosperity, mutual success models, and understanding, following some of what other leaders in industries do around that. And then secondly, I would be focused on lean tools. And with lean, the part that of what lean will provide as a benefit is elimination of waste, which leads to increases in flexibility for the business.
Okay, great. Hey, before we move on to your summary, another question, and it is as follows. With skyrocketing home delivery, how should teams be planning the logistics fulfillment?
Yeah. I see a lot of it's you're hearing a lot today. And if you're working in the fulfillment and logistics business today, you're seeing a lot of, hey, I don't have capacity, whether it's the UPS, FedEx, et cetera, is pushing back on companies. But going back to the SIOP piece and the planning piece, understanding what the forecasted demand is, and then working closely with those carriers to lock in that capacity. And it's a traditional business where if demand goes up, they're going to try to raise prices, et cetera. I think you have to understand that some of those dynamics are going to happen. Obviously, part of our jobs as supply chain leaders is to push back on those increases. But the biggest part is to work with the carriers ahead of time to lock in the go forward capacity. So the biggest thing I think people can be doing today is taking their forecast and using that forecast to lock in availability of demand of supply.
Great, excellent. Okay, so a summary, you want to move into this and we'll
Sure.
get things wrapped up here soon?
So from a summary standpoint, I think from a supply chain overall, we're seeing the attention and the impact of supply chain hitting all of us, and which is a great thing. It's great for people's careers. It's great opportunity. At the same time, it means much more focus and attention. And so if we make mistakes, if there's issues, especially since we've had 9 months as leaders to respond to the COVID impact, I expect that the executives, the board of directors, the CEOs, et cetera, are going to be much less forgiving going forward. We also need to be prepared now, right? And a lot of that investment is things that don't necessarily give a immediate cost savings return. They aren't simple items out there, and that will require a change in mindset for a lot of employees, and a change in mindset in working with our peer, our executive peers, and going in and saying, hey, I understand, we've always focused on, these traditional metrics of cost, cash, inventory management, et cetera. We need to adjust some of that. And so I think there's a change of working with our peers and then working with our partners out there of how, what are they thinking of in terms of supply chain? And then finally working on the metrics and how do we measure? Because fundamentally, I think we all know you get what you measure. And so we need to be thinking in terms of forward-looking metrics and thinking in terms of metrics that manage our risk and provide us more flexibility versus just your traditional bottom line metrics out there, or at least in addition to your bottom line metrics.
Mike, I do have a question for you that I've seen somewhat challenging in these times, and that is around, and you hit the point very well, frankly, really well, around building relationships and relationship management. But what we're seeing is in these times, people are getting laid off, people are moving on to new assignments and so forth. And having many times those personal relationships is very short-lived, unfortunately, because of the continual flux and churn that many are experiencing. And so investing in the relationship is undoubtedly something one needs to do, but at times it becomes a little frustrating because those relationships seem to perish quite quickly. Sometimes the shelf life is shorter than what we would typically see. Your thoughts or any comments on that?
I think it's a great point of, the length of people with companies today is shorter, changes faster. My experience has been the investment in relationships are very valuable regardless of what, the career path somebody pursues. A lot of times you end up maintaining those relationships company to company, and even industry to industry, because, so company A can help company B. That's the first part. I think the second part to that question is, again, if I look at companies that have been really successful through COVID and have received, for lack of a better term, their unfair share of supply, their better treatment, et cetera. It's those who've committed upfront to the relationship. That doesn't necessarily have a clear investment of time with the return of, cost reduction or in product improvement. But you're changing the dialogue. The dialogue moves into how do we succeed together, and the companies are able to mutually work together for success.
Great. Hey, I'm looking at the screen if there's any other questions, and I don't see any. So why don't we wrap things up, Mike? Sharing with folks your email address. Any closing comments that you have before we sign off today?
I think the only closing comments would be, feel free to reach out to me. Jim has my email address here. Any questions you may have about how to, improve your supplier relationships, as we mentioned, different metrics, anything in terms of the tools and toolkits that you'd be looking for, I'm happy to share in my experience and help you out appropriately as well.
Okay, great. And again, if the audience, need to get hold of us, you pretty much know how to do so, and feel free to reach out to me as well. So with that all said, thank you, Mike. Really do appreciate it. We'll wrap things up today, and thank you for the audience members who joined in. The recording will be available here in a relatively short fashion, and everyone take care and please be safe. Bye-bye now.